do this. Okay. Interestingly enough, as is, I mentioned, I think before, during some of my services, I have been recording services and then putting it on our website. But sometimes when you put it onto the YouTube, you get this, or I get this disclaimer about copyright. And I thought maybe it was because I was holding up this book, but what it turned out to be, because I can find out on my YouTube exactly from what point to what point am I infringing or what happens. And as it turns out, it's because I'm putting up the words to the sutras on the screen. And apparently, I guess it's just an automated thing. Anything that you put up, they'll flag it, and then if somebody wants to claim it, then they can claim it. But of all the things, I didn't think I would get copyright or flagged for putting words of the sutras onto the screen. But that's the world that we live in right now. So anyways, going back to some of the other teachings, what I wanted to talk about first was what we call the 5 aggregates. Interestingly enough, I had an email during this week asking about the self, or the soul, if you will, of an individual, and how Buddhism, we talk about non-self, and this whole idea is very difficult to grasp or conceptualize. And so this 5 aggregates is actually dealing directly with this idea of self. Okay, what is the self? And according to the Buddha, and you know, when you look at these, I'm sure when you read it, it was probably a little bit difficult or hard to grasp some of these ideas, I think. And there are many scholars that would actually say that Buddhism is not a religion because it doesn't base itself on a dogma or some outside force. Buddhism is to learn about the self and the study of the self. So there are scholars that would say Buddhism is actually not a religion, but more closer to psychology. And I think Buddhism does overlap a lot with science and what modern day science is saying today. But I don't think that it necessarily needs to preclude itself from being considered a religion as well. Religion can be an activity, or religion does not necessarily have to be faith-based in the sense of thinking of an outside power that controls us. Religion can be actually the search of truth, of people gathering together on a path, a spiritual path, to search for truth, to find out who am I? What is the self? Questions such as that. So I think there are many areas that they do overlap, and it doesn't necessarily mean one has to be this or that, right? So anyways, going into this 5 aggregates, and these sections that I'm going to talk about, it does get a little bit scholastic or kind of up here, intellectual almost. And so it might get a little bit confusing. And if you have questions, please feel free to stop me and say, Sensei, what does that mean? And I will try to do my best to either answer or to try to figure it out together, maybe. So basically what Buddhism, what the Buddha said was that what we call the self, or everything actually, is composed of what we call 5 aggregates. So aggregates mean that things are coming together, okay? So it doesn't mean that there's one single entity. And the coming together of these 5 elements or 5 things create what I call my I or myself. Okay, but that's really an illusion, if you will, because what I consider myself is coming together of these causes and conditions. So the first one that the Buddha talked about was what we call form, or rupa, or in Japanese, shikyu. And it includes all material objects, internal, external. And it recognizes the following. First of all, and I talked about this a little bit. When did I talk about it? I think I talked about the 8 consciousness before, and this was part of that. Okay, so it talks about the elements that make up our body, and according to Buddha, the elements were the earth, water, fire, and air. Some writings have also this thing. It's basically like an ether that they also include, but usually it's earth, water, fire, and air. Okay. And then our 6 organs and their corresponding sense objects. So what this means is, well, our organs, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, our skin, and our brain or mind. And the sense objects that are associated with that. With our eyes, we see color and form. Okay. And with our ears, we hear sound. And with our nose, we smell odor. With our tongue, we taste. With our skin, we touch, tactile. And then with our mind, we think. So those are sense objects, they're called. Okay. And then from those sense objects, so when you sense something, or from the form, then you get these feelings that are associated with those sense objects. Okay, so that's when our physical and our mental organs come in contact with the outside, the external, and we begin to feel different things about it. And basically, we can feel several ways. We could either feel it as pleasant, we could feel it as unpleasant, or it'll be neutral. Okay. So an example of this is if you touch a hot stove, the immediate reaction you're going to feel is that, ouch, that's hot. Okay. So that's your tactile, your sense organ of touching, coming together with a hot stove, and then you feel, you have a sensation of heat. But then you get what we call perception. Okay, so perception is based on once you feel, then you perceive things. And what perception is based on our past experiences as well as other factors that make what we feel. Perception has a judgment element to it that says, when I feel this, I perceive it in a certain way. In other words, this morning, right, was very cold. So actually, I went golfing this morning with my Uncle Kuni. And because I knew it was going to be cold, I bundled up. In fact, my wife looked at me this morning. He says, "Are you going skiing or are you going golfing?" Because I was all bundled up for it. But because I was bundled up, when I went out there, it felt actually quite comfortable. So I didn't feel biting cold, right? So in other words, because of me being bundled up, I have a certain reaction or perception of the cold. But if I didn't dressed that way, I would have perceived it quite differently. If I went out just in a golf shirt and shorts, I would be freezing out there, right? So perception is based on our past experiences as well. Okay? And then from that perception, then we have what we call the formation of volition. So we're up to perception, so form, feelings, or sense and perception, they're all sort of, in a way, reacting to a stimuli, okay? Volition now takes that what you've perceived, and now you've internalized it, and you're actually now processing it, and you're going to do something about it, okay? So volition is actually associated with what we call karma, okay? Karma, the word karma, you've all heard karma before, is action with volition, is all karma means. Action with volition. So in other words, if you have, the moment you think about something, then there's an action associated with that, and then the karma ends up with a result. So depending on your action, there comes an outcome, okay? So up until the point of perception, it's basically you just reacting to the immediate stimulus. But from volition on, it becomes creating karma, creating an action. So now you're reacting to whatever is going on. So when we perceive something, and if we say like it, then our thoughts would be, I want to maintain this, or I want to get that feeling again, whatever that might be. That's then becomes volition, okay? It's changed now from just perceiving something to an actual thought process that you're having. So then from there, the karmic outcome, or as volition develops, then it becomes consciousness. So that person gets a certain mindset about whatever experience that they've had. Okay. So these 5 things, they're called aggregates, the Buddha said, are constantly, and it's not like one, it's like I mentioned with the Eightfold Noble Path, they're almost simultaneous. So you can't say that this is a sort of a step-by-step process. They all happen at once, and they all change. Things change constantly. And so the Buddha said, because they're all constantly changing, there is no actual thing as a permanent self, because we're made up of these 5 aggregates, these elements and form and feelings and perceptions and volitions and consciousness, and that's always constantly changing. So because of that, it's very hard to say, this is my unchanging self. Okay. So a couple of examples of this. If you joined us this past Sunday, I actually gave a talk, and I used an example of a German philosopher by the name of Arthur Schopenhauer, and he did an interesting study on the theory of happiness, right? And what his theory that he came up with was that the sense of fulfillment is based on a numerical ratio of possessions versus desires, right? Where what he said is basically, if your possessions outweigh your desires, then you're feeling content. Okay, this is Arthur Schopenhauer came up with this theory of happiness. But in that, if we take this model of the 5 aggregates and we look at it, As just a very simple example, there's a joke that I've told many, many times, so most of you probably have heard me tell the joke before, but this is a good example of this, if you will. It'll maybe clarify things a little better. Okay, so the joke is about I shouldn't say elderly couple. Maybe, well, what's the term you use, Ted? Junior, senior couple, right? So not too elderly, but getting on in their ways, on their days. And this couple, both are starting to lose their sense of hearing, right? And both the husband and the wife feel that the partner, their hearing loss is worse than their own, right? So the whole joke is that the story goes that the man decides one day that he's going to finally prove it to his wife that her hearing is worse than his. So he sees her cooking in the kitchen and he calls from the dining room. He says, "Can you hear me?" And he doesn't get any reaction from, reaction, so he steps a little closer, and again he says, "Can you hear me?" And she's still facing the stove. And so he goes right up behind her and says, "Can you hear me now?" And she whirls around and she says, "For the third time already, yes, I can hear you." Right? So that's the joke that's told, right? So what happens here is, okay, so the gentleman had a certain perception before he started calling out his wife. He perceived that she is hard of hearing, right? He had this assumption. And when he called her and didn't hear the reply, his assumption was that she is hard of hearing. But the reality, of course, was he wasn't hearing her answers, right? So perceptions change, when he realized, the joke is in fact that he was the one that was hard of hearing, and that's his perception changes at that moment. So what we call the self is constantly changing, depending on our perception, depending on our senses, what we see, what we hear, and because of that, things change. I saw on a news clip the Ivanka and Jared Kushner have settled into Florida, and there they were with their 3 little kids having ice cream. And again, perceptions change, because up until now, you only saw them, or I only saw them at the White House, but when you see that she's a mother of 3 kids, or they're parents of 3 kids, and they're normal people, right? Perceptions change, and our ideas change. So we change along with that. So that's what the Buddha said about these 5 aggregates. Because we're made up of these 5 aggregates that are constantly changing. What is the glue to those aggregates to make up one body? Oh, there's a question from Junichi-san. Oh, thank you for that question. There is no glue, actually. Maybe it's the ego. It could be our false ego. So when we look at these 5 aggregates, then we have to automatically, well, not automatically, but as is the case in many Buddhist teachings, they cross-reference one another. So underneath this consciousness of the 5 aggregates, you also have what we call the manas, or the subconscious, right? And the subconscious is the one that identifies myself as separate from everything else. This is the one that says, subconscious is where the whole idea of I starts formulating, okay? I differentiate myself from everything else. That's not on the conscious level, that's deeper down. Okay? And below that subconscious is what they call the alaya vijnana consciousness, or arayashiki in Japanese, the storehouse consciousness. And the storehouse consciousness is actually connected with all other living beings, all other living things. And that's that consciousness that said that all of our experiences, everything that happens to us, it all gets put into this store consciousness. And then seeds are created in that store consciousness. They call Thich Nhat Hanh calls them seeds, but you can also look at it as potentiality. So within that store consciousness, and what I wrote in I think the last class, the notes I wrote, it's the DNA of our consciousness. It's all in there, and depending on the different encounters we have, the different nutriments we have, if we have wholesome nutriments, then you will create from those seeds a wholesome consciousness or a positive consciousness. If you have negative nutriments or toxins, then you'll create unwholesome consciousness, right? So the idea is the glue that holds those aggregates together is probably our ego, what we think is separate from everything else. But and I was reading a book by D.T. Suzuki on Mahayana Buddhism, and he was mentioning that in fact modern science is coming up to this very same conclusion, is that we think of ourselves as single entities, but we aren't. We live in an ecosystem. Like if you look at ecologists will say we live in a symbiotic ecosystem. So we can't think of ourselves as being separated from everything else. Oh, wait a second. Jennifer's got a question. Okay. If the steps from perception to consciousness to action to using volition are instantaneous and fluid, how does one break pattern of ego and selfishness? Oh, very good question. So how do we break this cycle? And that's the whole point of Buddhism, is that through our practices, through mindfulness, or there are different paths to it, let's put it that way. So there are some paths that say, I actually do very strict physical practices, and through those practices, I rid myself of my ego. That's one path. There's another path that says, I am a being completely incapable of doing any practice. And I end up, in the end, I realize I come to this state where I have to let go of my ego. And just by letting go of my ego, you can encounter something much greater. And that comes through different processes, and I will try to get to that when we get to my next lecture series, which will be more on specifically Jodo Shinshu and the experience of Shinran Shoni. And so that's another path of letting go of the ego. But these five aggregates are always with us, and it is extremely difficult for us to overcome or attain that non-self, if you will. So those are the five aggregates. The next one is what he called the 6 paramitas. The 6 paramitas are actually part of Mahayana Buddhist thought. Okay, in the Buddhist development, we have Buddhism after the historical Buddha passed away. Over the many centuries, Buddhism developed into three distinct groups. The one that went through what we call Southern Asia is what we now call Theravada Buddhism. Theravada means ways of the elders. They tend to be the more orthodox and orthodox. Why don't I use that word? They try to follow the teachings exactly as the Buddha, or try to live their lives exactly as the Buddha did 2,500 years ago. Okay, so they're the ones that you see in usually the orange robes with their heads shaved. They're very monastic order. You have monks and nuns. And then you have lay people who, the responsibility of the lay community is to support the monks and nuns. So it is said that when one person enters the brotherhood or the sisterhood, becomes a part of what we call. So Sangha, in our terminology, when we talk about Sangha, we talk about community, but in a very strict sense, Sangha is actually the ordained clergy. So it's those people who have left their houses to enter the monastics. Okay, so when an individual enters a monastery in most parts of Southern Asia, their thought is that they are benefiting 9 generations of their family, or 7 generations, 7 generations of their family are benefiting from that act of that one individual in entering the monastery. So the role of the lay people are to help to support the monastics, according to the Theravada school of Buddhism. The other school, which was the Mahayana school that spread to Northern Asia, China, Korea, Japan in particular, as Buddhism developed, there were those that felt we have to strictly abide by the rules and regulation, live exactly as the Buddha had what he had set out. But there was another school that was developing that said maybe it's more the ideals of the Buddha that we should be following. So the Buddha said, just before he passed away, the historical Buddha said, let my teachings, let yourself be the light, and let my teachings be your light. Right? Those who only see the physical body do not see the true Buddha. Those who practice the Dharma, those see the true Buddha. So in saying that, what the Buddha said was that the teaching was more important than himself. So this other school said, well, what are the ideals that the Buddha was trying to talk about? And they came up with the idea that all beings are equal, including the Buddha, and all beings have the capacity to attain the same enlightenment as the Buddha. And so the goals of Mahayana Buddhism started to change a little bit. And that it became more and more, how do we become Buddhas ourselves? And more importantly, how do we do this together? So what became emphasized more and more was what we call the Bodhisattva path. And Bodhisattva is originally, Bodhisattva was an individual, a seeker of the Dharma. That's how it was defined. But as Buddhism develops, Bodhisattva became an individual who has all the qualifications to become a Buddha himself or herself, but instead of becoming a Buddha, they forego their own enlightenment to help others. So this is an expression of compassion. And so until all beings can attain enlightenment, they forego their own enlightenment. Okay? So there are, within the Mahayana school, there are some ideals that became formed about these bodhisattvas and what they do. So they call these the 6 paramitas, or the 6 perfections, bodhisattva perfections. And the first of these is what we call dana paramita, or Japanese fuse haramitsu. Or when this is translated, it's translated as selfless giving. Now, what does selfless giving mean? One way of looking at it is to give 100%, so that there's no ulterior motive in there. I've given the Dharma talk before on Halloween, where when my wife and I, when our family first moved to Ontario, that very first year, I remember giving out candies and feeling very proud being now the homeowner, the one giving out the candies. And after a while, though, I started getting feeling a little bit unhappy. And I said to my wife, these kids nowadays, they don't even say thank you, right? And my wife looked at me and she said, just get over it. They're only kids, right? And there was a situation where I realized that I was expecting something from that giving. So that's not selfless giving, okay? Selfless giving is when you completely give 100% of yourself. Or the other way of looking at it is when you letting go, actually, of the whole notion of giving. See, when we think that I am giving, we forget to realize that actually giving is only one half of the action that's happening. Without a receiver, you can't give. See, thanks to all of you being on the other side of this Zoom call, I'm able to give a lecture. Without you, I'd be just talking to myself, okay? Which I wouldn't do for an hour. I'd be put away somewhere if I was doing that. But thanks, so without the receiver, there is no giver. And Buddhism actually talks a lot about this, that everything is relative to everything else. So when we think about this, there comes the ultimate is when we think of our mortality. Okay. Without death, there is no life. Right? Think about it. Without death, there is no life. Right? So if everything went on and on and on and on, then it wouldn't be considered life. But because there is death, there is also life. Because there's this change, this moment exists. Okay? So Dana Paramita is when we get beyond this thought of I am giving. Okay? So it's the idea, the relationship exists. And giving is only one half of the equation. The receiving is also very important. So my homework for you, I guess, is that right now, during this pandemic, there is so many people that need help. And so if you can give selflessly one thing to some, not necessarily here, but any organization you want to, or anything you want to do, try to do one act of selfless giving. So that's a homework for you. It's very difficult, actually. Very, very difficult. It's probably one of the most difficult things to do is to do something completely selfless giving. I think perhaps maybe the closest thing might be mother's love, but that's also very, very self-centered, because the mother's love is really based on one, their own child only. But in the sense of selfless, that the mother would do anything for them. Okay. So when we start thinking about this equation, or that giving is only one half of the equation, then we begin to actually answer a lot of things, such as the very famous Zen koan. Does a tree falling in an empty forest make a sound? Right? You need the person listening as well to be able to say that the sound was created. If you wanted to get, some philosophers would probably give different opinions about this, but you can start thinking about that. Or the more important one is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Right? Now that question is an ageless question, but in fact, they're mutually coexisting. So there's neither this one before that one. Mutually coexisting. So when we're talking about dana, it's giving and receiving are mutually coexisting. Selfless giving. So that's the first of the 6 paramitas, or 6 perfections, or ideals. Okay. The next one is the sila paramita. Sila or shila paramita are the observing of precepts. Okay. So starting off with very simple precepts, this is common to all lay individuals as well as the monastics, is what we call the 5 precepts. And they include not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to commit sexual misconduct, and not to take intoxicants. Okay. How many of those have you not done? Exactly. In one way or another, I think we're all guilty of these things, right? And these are the simplest of them. In fact, last night, my mother and I and Noriko, we were watching on the Japanese TV, NHK. They had this program. It's almost scary to watch. They were talking about the future, and that they said by 2030, unless we, mainly the people in the developed countries, change our way of living, by 2050, there will not be enough food for people, and that's like talking about people that we know will not have enough food. And one of the things that they said was that our consumption of meat we have to reduce it by, I think it was over 85%. If we reduce our consumption of meat by 85%, and now the science has a very interesting way they can calculate. They calculate the amount of water that is needed to create 1 kilogram of beef, and they can equate how much water is involved. And water is one of the most precious elements now on this world, because we're seeing, just by what we're doing, the water is quickly running out. So they said there's two things actually that we in the developed countries can do. First, they said, is to reduce our amount of meat consumption. And the second, just as importantly, is to reduce the amount of food waste that we have. In fact, the scientists have said that just by reducing our food waste in our developed countries, there is more than enough food presently to feed every single individual on this earth. But it's all the waste that we have. So anyways, it was a scary show to watch, but it's going to show that, we have to be mindful, and the 5 precepts are one way of being mindful. So, but we do these things, and we have to reflect on our own actions. In conjunction with that, and this wasn't in the book, but there's what we call the 5 grave offenses. And these are killing one's father, killing one's mother, killing an arahat, causing the Buddha's body to bleed, and causing disharmony within the Buddhist order or community. So you might think, well, I don't do any of those things, so I'm safe. But in fact, just by, you may not kill your mother or father, but you might think sometimes, oh, she's going to drive me crazy, or he's going to drive me crazy. So those thoughts alone are not good, okay? But those are 5 grave offenses that we try to not do. And then the next one is what we call a bodhisattva vows. Now, this is also not written in the book, but there are certain vows that all bodhisattvas make at the beginning of their career or their path. And there's ones that they call the 4 great vows, and these are common to all bodhisattvas. So the first one is, however boundless are the numbers of sentient beings, I vow to save them all. So a bodhisattva basically is a tireless worker. And then, however innumerable are the evil passions, I vow to extinguish them all. So a bodhisattva is a dedicated practicer. However inexhaustible are the teachings of the Buddha Dharma, I vow to study them all. And finally, however supreme the Buddha's path to enlightenment is, I vow to attain it. So these are 4 vows that every single, what we call bodhisattva, makes at the beginning of becoming a bodhisattva. So these are what we call the common vows as well, because they're common to all bodhisattvas. But along with that, there are also unique vows, ones that are made specifically by certain bodhisattvas or individuals. And one example of that are the 48 vows that Amida Buddha, in the form of what we call Dharmakara Bodhisattva, he makes 48 vows. And these define the uniqueness of Amida Buddha. So those are what we call the separate vows. Okay, so those are 2 different things. So bodhisattvas, following precepts, following vows are very important to the bodhisattvas. There is also another story. How many of you have seen, actually we have a statue of it in our, just off to a side room in our Hondo. There's what we call the Kannon, Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva, or Kuan Yin in Chinese. And there's one that has 11 heads. So on its head, it's got 10 different heads, and right at the very top is also the head of Amida Buddha. Okay, and so there's a whole story, depending on, so if you look up the texts, you'll find that they talk about these 10 heads being the 10 different stages of bodhisattva, getting to the point of being the Buddha, which is at the very top. But I heard a minister gave a Dharma talk about this bodhisattva, this Kannon Bodhisattva, and what it was said was that this Kannon Bodhisattva, the bodhisattva of compassion, vowed to save all the beings suffering in the realm of hell. And this bodhisattva practices and does all these things, meritorious deeds, to save every single being suffering in hell. And the bodhisattva completes this great endeavor and turns around just for a second to catch his breath. And as soon as he turns back around, hell is filled with beings suffering again. So then at that point, this bodhisattva vows, until every being in the 10 directions are saved, I will not rest. So 10 directions is something that they'll often say in Buddhism as well. 10 directions are north, east, south, west, northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest. That's 8 directions. And then you have zenith, which is up, and nadir, down, and that gives you 10 directions. So if you ever hear 10 directions, that's what they're talking about. Okay. But anyway, so this bodhisattva then has these 10 heads to look out all the different directions. And then on top of the very top is, of course, the image of Amida Buddha. So that was unique to this bodhisattva, Kannon Bodhisattva. Then the third of the 6 paramitas is what they call Kshanti paramita, which is perseverance or patience or forbearance is normally what it said. But in fact, Thich Nhat Hanh actually gave a very nice explanation of it in his book. He calls it inclusiveness. So what he says is, by having a large heart or being inclusive, you can persevere through any difficulties that happen. And he gives an example in the book of the monk Vietnamese monk during the Vietnamese, the war in Vietnam, and this monk gets spat on by an American soldier, but he doesn't hold hard feelings towards the soldier, and it's because he's in this mindfulness and is able to be inclusive. And what he says is that he gives the example of pouring a handful of salt into a small cup versus pouring the same handful of salt into a large river. And he says that in the in the small cup, the water will become very salty, but in the large river, the salt will not affect the taste that much, or if at all. And he says in like fashion, if we have a small heart, we'll feel the hatred much more than if we had a larger heart, an inclusive heart. The other difference, I think, of using this terminology, inclusiveness versus perseverance, is that the former is a proactive mindset. Inclusiveness means I am going to be open. I am going to receive. Whereas perseverance is I'm going to persevere through whatever hardship that comes at me. So I think inclusiveness is a much better word for this that Thich Nhat Hanh mentions in his book. The next one, Vira Paramita, is diligence. And this is basically a practice of earnestness. So the more earnest you are in your practice, doing your practice, the better result, or basically the more wholesome results will come about. And again, he uses that idea of the storehouse consciousness, and by being earnest in your mindfulness, then the seeds of the wholesome consciousness will come out from that storehouse. And then Dhyana Paramita is the meditation. So of course, I've talked about this in an earlier session about how there are two aspects: the shamatha, which is the stopping, calming, resting, and then there's the insight or mindfulness or vipassana. So in meditation, these two aspects are things that we have to keep in mind. And then finally, the prajna paramita is the wisdom, the insight that's one receives through following all these different paramitas or the different mindfulness. One can attain insight, and there prajna paramita becomes a very important philosophy within Mahayana Buddhism, because it talks about the fact of this wisdom that they talk about here is what we call a non-discriminatory wisdom of enlightenment, or it's a transcendent wisdom that goes beyond what we would normally consider as wisdom. And there are many different sutras that talk about this wisdom, and perhaps the most exemplary of that is what we call the Heart Sutra, or the Mahaprajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. And I've actually written an English translation of it in the text here. And basically, in this Heart Sutra, they talk about the true heart of the teaching of the Buddha, which is what we call sunyata, or emptiness, or sometimes thusness and suchness. These are all terminologies for it. But basically, in this Heart Sutra, it talks about the fact that form is not form. There's no birth, no death. And it goes on to say that form is not form, but it is also form is sunyata, and sunyata is form. So it can get very you can get confused reading it too. But it's also, if you really look into it and read it carefully, you realize there's a lot of very important truths to that. And when we can get to that wisdom or to that mindset, then we begin to see the waves are no different from the water, the ocean. They are expressions of the ocean, but they're also part of the ocean. And so I've spoken over my time. Does anybody have questions, or are you completely confused? As I said, this session was always going to be a little bit more, I think, scholastic. Or there are some comments. I thought Fuse was offerings to Sangha Buddhist monks. Yes, that's one. That is one definition of Fuse, but Fuse itself means selfless giving. So giving 100%. That's where it originates from. Interesting enough, I should also mention, for those of you who speak Japanese, so in Japanese, the head of the household is often called Danna-san, right? And that Danna comes from this word Dana, because the head of the household is the one that gives. Okay, so Danna-san, 99.9% of the time, I would say it's reference to the head male of the house. I've never heard. I don't think those who speak Japanese could correct me, but I've never heard of the wife being called Danna-san. It's the husband, but that it actually comes from this Buddhist word Dana. It's the one that gives, and that's how Danna-san comes about. So that's a Japanese lesson for you. Okay, I'm